All right, everybody, welcome in. It is the season finale of our rule study, season 4, which has really gone on for quite some time. We've been at it realistically since about February here with our rule study. Started first with, the rules changes, went back through interference, and then have obviously been on the track of obstruction here the last 3 or 4 weeks or so. And today is our finale on obstruction. We'll focus on type B here and wrap that up, and also talk about some interference versus obstruction, which kind of cycles back to some of the things that we did back last fall. Got a couple announcements though before we go ahead and get going. DJ's going to link a couple things in the chat here for us. First of which that we've been pushing is the post-game feedback form. I know a lot of leagues have started back up and started back playing here either this week or doing so in the next week or 2 weeks later. So as your umpires are working and you take a look at what your umpires are doing, and as you're working games, think about number one, what are you working on? Share that with us. What's going well, and then what are you struggling with? Because that'll give us some really necessary information to make sure that what we're doing, not only on 3 Up, 3 Down, but also in Little League and throughout the regions, is more specifically tailored to what exactly you guys need on the front line. So please use that post-game feedback form. You can just fill it out like once a week and just give us kind of an idea of what all exactly you are working on, what exactly is going well, what are you struggling with, what do you need help and support with, and DJ's got that linked in the chat here for us. The second thing here, as a lot of us go ahead and get back to the diamonds, and remember here those focal points, and I'll get those up here as I share my screen here with everybody. We issued these 5 earlier on in the season, and a lot of you guys have given us some really good feedback on these here. And these 5 focal points, I think, really kind of ground us back into the fundamentals of everything that we should be working on here as a lot of us return to the diamond. Those habits and skills of taking advantage of the routine plays. And then today specifically, as we take a look at a lot of our clips, I want to make sure that we highlight, number one, proper use of eyes, and secondly, chest to ball. So as we take a look at a lot of the clips today, kind of make sure that we're looking at those. And again, those fundamentals are all then built during our routine plays. And then we still talked about the wedge progression. That's kind of in the focal points of a lot of us to use. And then lastly, just being a good partner. So just kind of keep those in mind. Pick from that list as to what exactly you want to focus on. And as DJ has linked in the chat for us, and as has been out in the emails, please take some time to go ahead and fill out that post-game feedback form, and that'll give us an idea of, like I said, what are you working on, what's going well, what are you struggling with, so that we can give you a little bit better feedback and a little bit better instruction here moving forward. The last thing I got in terms of announcements here before we get rolling on a lot of things here for us is to go ahead and at least mention that next week we'll be right back at it. So usually we take a break in between seasons, but because of Memorial Day weekend coming up, we're just going to push right through to our next season. We're excited about the next season. The topic is going to be what makes plate umpires successful. So we'll look at the habits that essentially make successful plate umpires, and we'll have all that information released, and we'll continue then on same time, same place next week. But not before we go ahead and take a look at obstruction here in just a second, specifically type B, its enforcement, and then ultimately we'll take a look at some examples of interference versus obstruction. Any other questions or anything like that before we go ahead and dive right on in to what we've got here on tap for us today? Anything like that? Alrighty, well, what I want to start with here is just kind of a review. So I want to use the chat here like we have before, and the review question that I'm going to prompt you with here is very simple. Last week we introduced the difference between type A and type B obstruction. So there were 3 differences between type A and type B obstruction. So let's see here in the chat if we can list the differences between type A and type B obstruction, and then I'll have DJ read those back to us. So that's our opening question to kind of tie back where we were last week with where exactly we're going to head this week. What are the 3 differences here between type A and type B obstruction? Go ahead and drop those into the chat and see if we can get those here on in there for us.
All right, first one, whether or not we have a play being made on a runner.
Good. Okay, so type A, yeah, absolutely. A play being made on the obstructed runner versus a play not being made. So type A, a play being made. Type B would be no play. What's another difference here that may have popped up between type A and type B obstruction?
Nothing in the chat. Come on, boys, use that chat. There we go. Type A, immediate dead ball. You're given at least 1 base. Type B, you have a delayed dead ball.
Good. So we got all 3 of them then right here. The differences in type A versus type B obstruction. Type A, as we mentioned, play being made. Type B, no play being made. The ball is dead then in type A. play continues in type B. Now, that's a big point that we'll touch base with here, so I want to kind of foreshadow and highlight that idea of play continues, because we're going to use the entire duration of the play in type B obstruction to dictate what our award is. That's different than type A. Okay, so type B, we're going to allow the entire play to continue. Type B, we allow the play to continue. We're going to use the entire duration of the play to dictate our award. And as we mentioned, type A, at least one base. And then in type B, we're going to award things that would nullify the act of obstruction, if any, okay, and nullify the things that would go ahead and provide us then with the act of obstruction. Remember, a play defined as a ball and a runner. If you have no ball, you have no play, so you have type B. All right, we'll revisit type A a little bit later today. Focus for the most part on type B. Again, this is no play. We allow play to continue, and then we take all factors of the play to determine our award. If necessary, that would nullify the act of obstruction. A couple quick hitters here just to make sure that we're good to go with the definition of obstruction. We beat this one to death the last 3 weeks. Want to put it in front of us here right before we take a look at clips. Remember, obstruction is the act of a fielder who, while not in possession of the ball, impedes the progress of any runner. And remember, we do not have any clause that says that we're going to protect a fielder who is in the act of receiving a throw. That's not our rule book, okay? So if he blocks off the base and doesn't have the ball, we simply have obstruction. Now, we've gone through these guiding principles oftentimes in both interference and obstruction, and I want to go through these specifically to type B here yet again. Remember, type B here, and what we're looking at, is no play being made on the obstructed runner. No play being made on the obstructed runner. Play is going to proceed until no further action is possible. And that's going to allow us to take the entire frame of the play, not just the point in time in which the obstruction occurs. So it's the entire frame of the play that allows us then to dictate our award, or to, as you see here, impose a penalty, if any, that would nullify the act of obstruction. So type B, no play, play continues, and then ultimately at the end of it, we're going to figure out what would nullify the act of obstruction and then impose those penalties, if any. Remember, contact and intent are not required for obstruction. And then ultimately here, it's kind of like a traffic accident, I guess you could think about it. The cop who shows up at a traffic accident just asks, who made the mistake here? And it all is dictated by the idea of right of way. And we'll revisit the idea of right of way specifically when we take a look at interference versus obstruction. Okay, so again, a couple guiding principles to at least put out there and refresh our memory of before we go ahead and take a look at some clips. And as we look at clips here, I want to take a look, number one, at just the sheer enforcement of the penalty. So we'll take a look at the mechanics of it, some examples of it, clear up some of the things we talked about last week, and then kind of move into that idea of obstruction versus interference. DJ, anything else? Seth, anything else to add here before we go ahead and take a look at some clips or anything else from the chat to touch base with?
Chat's clear. All good with me.
Yep, nothing with me.
All right, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these clips. First one here that we want to take a look at is just the sheer enforcement of the obstruction penalty. Now, the obstruction is going to happen right over here by the shortstop. So that's where we're going to look here for this one. I've got a couple replays that'll show it as well. So we want to take a look at that example. Remember, type B is no play being made. We allow play to continue, and then once play stops, that's when we're going to go ahead and make our award. So let's take a look here at the example of interference. I'm sorry, the example of obstruction, and then take a look then here at the back end of it of how exactly it is then enforced. So here's the obstruction. You can see this here coming to us by the shortstop. It's going to disappear underneath my banner. We'll see a replay here in just a second so that you can see it. But again, one run scores, and then we have a close play at the plate. Okay, presumably we can probably say that this runner was out. Now remember, it's type B, so we're going to let the play continue. And then once the play has stopped, then we're going to go ahead and impose the penalties, if any, to nullify the act of obstruction. So now, because we had that obstruction, we have to figure out what would nullify that act of obstruction. That's completely up to us. And we saw just exactly how that would be enforced. So here's a look here again at the obstruction. Take a look at the shortstop. This is where we see the obstruction very clearly here. Great mechanic by the third base umpire. Take a look at the third base umpire. A point, and all we're going to say is that's obstruction. This umpire actually holds on to that's obstruction call for a little while, and I think that's what allows the plate umpire to see it. Plate umpire probably saw it as well. We allow play to continue, and then again here, once play stops, in this case we have a play being made on the obstructed runner. This is when we're going to go ahead and call time, which is exactly what happens here. He's going to say that's obstruction. Did the plate umpire? He called time, said he had obstruction, and then he awards the batter that runner safe at the plate. Another look here at the obstruction just so that we see it. Both umpires call the obstruction here. In this case, the plate umpire goes ahead and takes the spotlight and takes the call, which is permissible to go ahead and do. Another great example here of type B obstruction, very similar. Remember, no ball, so no play. So we go ahead and allow the play to develop, allow it to unfold. Let's take a look at the mechanics, but the award in this one's a little bit different. Still going to have a play at the plate on the back end of this runner, but again, the plate umpire, because there's multiple runners, there's actually runners at first and second here, he doesn't necessarily catch that R1 was obstructed at second base. So the award, or the spotlight, looks a little different than the clips that we have looked at prior to this point. And not one way is more correct than the other. Just as long as we do it in one of these manners, we'll be fine. Let's take a look at the example. Another base hit down the line. The runner from second is going to score easily. And then the obstruction that we're going to get here happens to be on R1. Okay? Now, again, this is R1 attempting to score. The play is close. The umpire is going to call the runner out. Okay? Now, again, let's take a look at the obstruction. It happens as R1 round second base. Here it is. Second base umpire is going to be the one with the call. We'll take a look at it right here. Great mechanic here by U2. He's going to point right at it, say that's obstruction. Remember, this is type B because there is no ball. We allow play to continue. And we take all considerations of the factors of the play that happened. Remember, it was a close play at the plate. Plate umpire calls him out. And then again, if you take a look, Chris Siegel's the second base umpire. He's right here by the mound. Okay, so if we take a look right there, he is. He's calling time, coming in and saying, hold up, buddy, hold up, hold up. And he's going to mention to his partner here, first off and foremost, like, hey, I had obstruction on that runner at second base. Okay, so he clearly points to the crowd, takes the spotlight here. Oops, I think I'm hitting too many buttons here. Let me get back to where I was. Sorry about that. Good look at it. All right, let it continue to go ahead and play out here just again. So we continue to basically see the obstruction there. And back to my point here, remember that was the obstruction that Chris Siegel had. U2, he points at it. And then the play at the plate happens. We get the runner out. Plate umpire didn't realize that we had obstruction. Here comes Chris Siegel, the second base umpire, into the mix. He says, wait a minute, I had obstruction at second base. Tells his partner first what he has, and then you can see, okay, that he's going to point directly at second base, take the spotlight here in this case because he had the call, and then he's going to point that runner who was obstructed at second base because of that obstruction, when he scored, he then is going to be safe, okay? So a great job here looking at two different ways to enforce and make the awards here by our umpires. If the plate umpire or the calling umpire would have caught it, we could definitely see him go ahead and make the award as we saw in the previous clip. But again, we allow play to continue, and with multiple runners, sometimes our partners don't catch on to it. That's fine. Allow the play to continue. Once it stops, then go ahead and get it right. Remember, we're going to let that play continue and then go ahead and take the spotlight and make the award. DJ, any questions or anything like that popping into the chat here for us to address?
Tony says, if you're not awarding bases, would you still call time? And if so, what are the mechanics for a no base award? I think we actually have a clip for keeping somebody at the same base.
Yep.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, we do. That's a great question, and that'll foreshadow us into that one too, Tony. And that's a great question. If in this case here, like that run scored easily, let's say that there was no play at the plate, we would just completely ignore the obstruction whatsoever. We wouldn't even take the spotlight or address it whatsoever. Okay. If somebody asks us about it, maybe we could say, well, yeah, I had obstruction at second base. But again, if he scores easily or is safe at the plate, we just kind of drop the obstruction. Life goes on. Good question.
And then just clarifying that we're not necessarily calling a runner who was obstructed safe or out. We're calling time at the end of a play and enforcing any awards to the base. Just a point of clarity there. Kyle asks, how close does the ball need to be in reference to the play? In a rundown situation, you would have type A, or would you have type A or B depending on which direction the runner is going?
Yeah, and we've got one of those examples here coming up too, Kyle, so we'll get there here as well. But what I would also say is it is up to you, completely up to you. So remember, you get the choice. What would nullify in your mind the act of obstruction? So for me to give a pure black and white answer there is really tough, just because every situation is differently. So if you thought by the act of obstruction he would have scored in this case rather than being in a rundown, then you score him. If rather you had him protected to third base and that was it, in your mind, that is what would have nullified the act of obstruction. So in type B obstruction here, without the ball, we get to, yes, take a look at the factors of the play as it plays out. But again, once we see it play out and we can adjust our award if we want to. We can adjust the award if needed because we let the play out. But at the same time, at the end of it, we have to take whatever action or whatever penalty would, in our mind, nullify the act of obstruction. So that's kind of relevant and to and independent to each play and ultimately each umpire's judgment.
Semi-related, is obstruction always called with the right arm? I know that I typically do information with the left arm, and I would consider obstruction information. I think it's more probably just a personality. What are your takes on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it matters, just as long as we get it like either, left arm, that's obstruction, or right arm, that's obstruction. Doesn't matter. Just as long as we point it. I don't think the other thing too with the point and mechanic, let's not like point and pull it back. We're not trying to hide it. Let's just go ahead and say, hey, that's obstruction. I got it, and just kind of hold it out. Because number one, that's going to alert you that you have obstruction, but even more so, that nonverbal, as we've seen in these clips, is really important for partner communication. So when you point either with the right or left arm, I mean, I think either one is fine. Just make sure we say that's obstruction, kind of hold it out for a couple seconds. Maybe your partner catches on to it, whatever the case may be. But at the same time, that also may help you in the back end of things to where you don't have the coach or give the appearance that the coach is saying, hey, he was in the way, he was in the way. You've got your arm outstretched and you said, yeah, I saw it. He'll let it go. He'll continue to coach. Maybe that'll help mitigate some confusion there as well.
All right. We had one more question in the chat just pop up.
Mm-hmm.
It said, would it also be proper in this example to have you two call time, tell the plate umpire what he had, and then let the plate umpire reverse the call at the plate instead of you two making that award?
I don't think it matters, to be quite honest with you, just as long as the award is there. But at the same time, you two had the obstruction, and therefore he is the umpire whose judgment matters in making the award. So I think, either way is fine. If he said, because my guess is that exchange probably was exactly that. Like, hey, do you want to take this call or do you want me? And the plate umpire probably said, no, you've got it. You take it. So that's completely fine. Just as long as it's called and the award is what the crew wants to place to nullify the act of obstruction. And that's definitely something to talk about. I think both those two umpires, that's probably exactly what we saw when Chris came in and said, hey, I had obstruction. Then they probably said, all right, do you want to take it or you want me to? And the plate umpire just said, you take it. And Chris did his thing. Good question. All right, let's take a look at another example here of obstruction. This is type B. Base hit here. R1 is who we're going to have obstruction on at third base. We don't necessarily see it in this frame, but the obstruction happens right about now. You can see the kind of tail end, the third baseman and R1, who is now reaching third base, kind of run into each other. He stumbles, and then we get a play back into the base. Now, to DJ's point here, he made this point earlier. When we have this one in this situation, ideally, in an ideal world, we do not make a call here, all right, because no play can be made on an obstructed runner here. We do allow play to continue, but again, we have no call here. Instead, we have time, and then we have the award. So this one is a great mechanic here. Look at time. No, I had obstruction. He pointed at the obstruction, and then he says, you're awarded third base. He's safe there, okay? So here's the obstruction. And in this umpire's judgment, as he's trying to round the base here, him stumbling off the base and losing his balance is what caused him to get picked back off. And as a result of that action by the defense, that went ahead and to nullify it, he's going to call this runner safe. And again, great job. He's not out or safe in here. We're not making that call. We're just going to call time as this umpire does. He's going to point back and say, I have obstruction as he rounded the base. This runner then here is awarded third. He is safe right here. Very clear mechanic, very well done mechanically here in this clip. Now, another one here to take a look at that's pretty interesting. This is a bunt attempt. The bunt is actually going to go down the third base line. The first baseman's going to charge. He's going to charge in, and as the first baseman charges in, as you see here with R1 only, those two individuals collide. So you don't necessarily see it in the first frame, but you will see it here in the second frame. So here's the bunt attempt down the line, and then you can see if you take a look over on the right side of the screen, R1 got laid out by the first baseman. All right, so the catcher picks it up, throws it on down the line. And then now all of a sudden you can see here that our U1 correctly goes ahead and signals obstruction. This was several years ago. So this is back when we were using like the fist pointed out instead of the point of obstruction. So it's an older mechanic. Nonetheless, ball goes down the line here. And as you can see at this point, the umpires are going to let the play continue because that's what we're supposed to do in type B. And then remember, umpires can make whatever awards they would like to make to nullify the act of obstruction. So they can either decide to keep runners at first and second here, or potentially with the errant throw, they could factor that into the equation and potentially move runners elsewhere. Okay, and again, remember, we have the opportunity to nullify the act of obstruction, whatever that may be in our minds. Here's a look at the replay, and you'll see the obstruction here. Great job by these two umpires. U1 is I highlighted already, but take a look at the work of the plate umpire too. First, look at the obstruction. Right there it is. Okay, so a fielder who not in possession of the baseball, and obviously this one's down the line, the third base line, so the first baseman is not necessarily necessary to this play, so he's not going to be protected, and we'll talk about that as we look at interference here in a second. But nonetheless, this one goes wild down the line. We almost have a runner passing another runner, ironically, on this one too, which again would allow us to nullify the act of obstruction because the obstruction would go ahead and have caused that. Okay, and again, we can take whatever action we want to nullify the act of obstruction. DJ Seth, anything there?
Nope, there was a question about obstruction mechanics, but you covered it right there.
Cool. All righty. Another great job here by this plate umpire. Remember, he had fair foul down the third base line, and he's right back on the line here again. So excellent job here by that plate umpire. Some great fundamentals of plate mechanics. All right, before we get into interference versus obstruction, the other thing that I want to go ahead and clear up here is a concept we covered last week, and that concept here was, obstruction, or what we call minor obstruction. So like we have a play into the base as we see developing here, and then the throw goes wild, and then we get kind of tangled up between the fielder and the runner. That's called minor obstruction here. So this is still type B because there's no ball present. So the ball bounces away as we saw happen in this throw. Now, what's important to note here is that some contact is going to be inevitable. The fielder's trying to field the ball, the runner's coming into the base. There's going to be some type of contact here. Remember, one of the general guiding principles is just because there is contact doesn't necessarily mean that there is obstruction. But what we're looking for here is, number one, yes, some inevitable contact is going to be there, but we're looking for kind of a second act that would prevent the runner or impede the runner from advancing, just as we saw in the World Series clip last week. So here, we have a reset where both them come down. At this point, both of them are trying to do what they want. But this second act, or the second action here, is this little leg whip that this fielder gives to the runner. And in the umpire's mind in this clip, this was the second action, the leg whip or the leg flip. And this was also true in the World Series clip last week that would warrant the call of obstruction and allow, in this case, the umpire to nullify it by awarding this runner home plate. So when we have minor obstruction, when the ball gets away, yes, some contact is going to be inevitable. We're going to let that one go so long as the runner and the fielder are generally doing what they're supposed to do. But if there's a second act committed by the fielder, in this case, it's the leg whip, that prevents or impedes the runner from advancing, we're going to go ahead and probably go ahead and be warranted with an obstruction call and have that to be nullified. Another great example here. So you had the second act in that one. Let's take a look at there was a second act in this one. This is a double play ball. The ball's going to get away from the first baseman here. Now again, the first baseman gives chase. There is a little bit of contact right there between the batter runner and then the first baseman as he tries to get this errant throw. We pick up the errant throw, and then the runner is out at second base. Okay. Again, this contact that we see up the line, both the fielder and the runner essentially do what they're supposed to do. And remember here, the guiding principle for us to realize here in minor obstruction is if there is a second act that impedes the progress of the runner. Okay, so again, both of them have done what they've been supposed to do. I'm not saying that we're protecting the fielder here. That's not what I'm saying. But we have to understand that there is going to be some minor contact here. We're looking for a second act, not intent, but a second act that would inevitably impede the progress of the runner. You can see here that this umpire does a great job of indicating that that is nothing, that he does not have anything whatsoever. There's no interference. There's no obstruction on that play by just indicating that the runner is safe. Now, you can say that he was safe on the play. I think everybody in the ballpark and everybody watching understood that this runner is safe. But very clearly here, he has told his partners, he has told the offense and the defense that play can continue. This is not obstruction. He's got nothing. He's got no interference or anything like that. Play continues, and then the runner is out at second base. All right. Good look there at the mechanics here of type B obstruction. All right. Now, last fall, we circled back to obstruction versus interference. This is kind of the last concept that I want to cover today. I've got two clips here for us. I'm going to do one, and then Gary Groutman, who does a lot of rules instruction out in the West, he's going to take us through the IBAR clip because they use that one quite a bit, and quite frankly, I want to hear how exactly they present it. So just to give us a little bit of criteria and understanding here for the difference between obstruction and interference. Remember, we've been through obstruction. I think we get that. But to recall interference here, an act by the offense that does any of those things, right? And that's what our previous series took a look at. And specifically, we're talking and debating about the right of way. Remember, the right of way on a thrown ball belongs to the base runner, as we've talked about the last 4 weeks. But the right of way on a batted ball belongs to the fielder. But if there are 2 or more fielders that are involved in fielding a ball, now an umpire has to make a decision. Which fielder are we going to protect? And that is where we get obstruction versus interference, when we have basically 3 parties involved, a runner and then 2 fielders. And as I mentioned, we've got to figure out which fielder we are going to protect for the purpose of the rule. The rule that we use is 709J. And basically what this tells us is, yes, the runner has to avoid a fielder who is attempting to field a batted ball. And if the runner does not, remember, that's a violation of right of way. That should be interference. However, 709J also tells us that if 2 or more fielders are involved, we as umpires, and there's contact, we have to decide as umpires which fielder is entitled to the benefit of fielding the ball. Which one are we going to protect? Which fielder are we going to protect? And if there is contact between the fielder that we are not protecting and the runner, we cannot call the runner out, but rather we have obstruction. Okay, so this is where we get the difference between obstruction and interference. Again, 3 people involved, basically a runner and 2 fielders. We determine which fielder we think is entitled to field the ball. And if the runner and the fielder that we are not protecting collide, then we have obstruction. So that's the difference here in obstruction versus interference situations. Let's take a look at those 2 clips here, one of which comes to us from the Central Region Tournament back in 2018. A chopper back up the middle. And right here in the freeze frame, you'll see that the shortstop and R2 in this situation collide. Now, very clearly, take a look at the position of the baseball. It's on the right side of the infield. So here, at this point, umpires have to determine, number 1, which fielder are we protecting? Which fielder is entitled to field the ball? It's on the right side of the infield. I would probably say that the second baseman here is entitled to field this ball. And as a result, I would have obstruction on the shortstop. Now, this is type B obstruction. There is no ball involved here. Okay, so this is type B obstruction. There is no ball, which means that umpires can take whatever action or whatever penalty, if any, they think would nullify the act of obstruction. Now, the second baseman fields it. He throws it to third base. And as we see here, our third base umpire does call the obstruction. Again, older mechanic back in 2018. We still have obstruction, but the crew calls this runner out because, again, we have the ability to take any penalty or impose any penalty, if any, that would nullify the act of obstruction. Okay, again, take a look at the rule 709J. We have to figure out 2 fielders here. Which one are we going to protect? The crew decided this one belonged to the second baseman. Therefore, obstruction on the shortstop. Type B obstruction it is. And as a result, the out at third base would stand. Okay, the out at third base would stand. There's a good look at the obstruction there. Gary, I'll go ahead and give it over to you here now for this next one, a pretty interesting clip here.
Thank you, Stu. The challenge here is going to be stopping it every now and then between you and me. So let's let it run for a second and see what we get.
Okay.
Got a bounding ball down the first base line. Pitcher and first baseman come together. The runner at this point appears to veer to the inside to avoid the play. It looks like the runner is supposing that the first baseman will make the play on the ball, but at the last second, the pitcher reaches in front of the first baseman's glove to take the ball. The runner and the pitcher now collide. The umpire is trailing up the line for the fair foul call, and he also takes the obstruction call right here. Let it roll, please. Pitcher shows the umpire, I've got the ball in the tag. Here you can see the pitcher reaching in front, and you can see the tail end of the runner veering into the base, into the fair territory with the intent potentially of trying to avoid the first baseman who the runner potentially believes was making the play. I'm using a lot of conditional words here because it's very, very difficult to determine exactly what the intent of everybody in the middle of this play. The other thing I think it's important is there is no requirement at all for the umpire who rules on the obstruction or the interference to make any kind of determination until the play is over. If he's protecting the first baseman, when the pitcher grabs the ball, he can immediately and without any other indication shift the protection to the player who's actually making the play. In my mind, the beauty of this clip and the training value here is you can argue strongly both ways. The plate umpire is going to call obstruction. You can definitely see elements of interference. And that would beg a question of a younger umpire. Can I have obstruction and interference on the same play? And the answer is going to be no. It's going to be one or the other. But a split second later, you could have a second violation pop up. And so that then becomes an interesting situation of, in this case, we've got an obstruction or interference before first base. So by definition, it's a type A obstruction if called, or the interference, if you go that way, would be a situation where you'd be awarding first base on the call anyhow. So when I teach this, it's obvious that we get a decision by the umpire. But if you put yourself into the mindset of, what if I argue about the obstruction being the correct call? What would be the elements I'd look at, and how would I show that? Because you clearly got potential obstruction. And then you look at the elements of interference here. What are those going to be, and how would I handle the interference aspects of it? It's interesting that this play also, after a long discussion on the field, goes to a protest. And it's one of the few that really, I'm sure, caused a lot of discussion in the MLB office as they reviewed the potential play here. But the key points are, you've got a runner who may be attempting to avoid. You've got a defense who's making a proper play. So potentially we have everybody, with Stu's analysis point there, everybody's doing what they should be doing. How do we justify, or how do we break that down further? So I'll stop there, Stu, and go back, let you run with it for a second.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, Gary's points are awesome. I love to hear him. The biggest thing here, too, that by rule, we have two fielders involved trying to make a play. So we have to decide between interference and obstruction, okay, because there's contact. So all factors of 709J are already in the play. Now, to Gary's point, we just have to figure out, all right, who are we protecting? Now, many of you guys are saying, well, the pitcher has the ball. How can you commit obstruction if you have the ball? And what was, and Gary made this point, and what was ruled and what was kind of came about here was that the pitcher took the opportunity away from the first baseman. And because the pitcher basically has to come off the hill to make this play, that's why the umpires, particularly the plate umpire here, determined that he was guilty of obstruction. Okay, that he basically took this one away, that this was the first baseman's play to make, and that the pitcher took that opportunity away. The runner, as we see here, if you're thinking about runner's lane interference and things like that, does not apply here. Number one, runner's lane interference, the only time the runner has to be in the runner's lane is if a throw is coming from behind him. The throw is not coming from behind him. And then again, he can be outside of the running lane in order to avoid the fielder, which he has to by 709J. But again, 709J says that we have two fielders that are fielding the same batted ball, and there's contact. Now the umpire has to make a decision. It's all up to the umpire. Who do you protect? Because the pitcher had to come off the hill and basically reached out and took the ball from the first baseman. He calls, the umpire does, the pitcher, even though he has the ball, for obstruction here. And this is batter runner obstructed before first base. That's type A. The batter then would go ahead and be awarded first base.
Hey, Stu, could you back the clip up about 3 or 4 seconds?
Yep, I sure can.
I want to take a look at the base runner here.
Let's see if we can get here.
A little more, one more, a little more. There. You can see the right foot of the runner is pretty much on the fair foul line. And then you can see a definite change of direction by the base runner to the inside, looking to avoid the first baseman. That was one of the key points that comes out in the discussion of this. Why would you deviate to one side or the other trying to avoid the play if you thought the pitcher was going to be the protected fielder? You go the other way, which is, you can't assume that the action one way or the other was going to be that way. This was a really tough call. The call in the field was, like you say, Stu, obstruction by the pitcher, and we got the award of first base. Back to you.
All right. DJ Seth, anything you got there here to add into the mix here? Any takeaways or anything like that here before we go ahead and wrap some things up?
I'll go with me.
Couple things here just for me to wrap things up with regards to obstruction. I think number one, in a lot of these clips, and for those of you guys that watch it back and stuff like that, I thought our umpires in each of these clips do a great job of, number one, using their eyes properly, that they're trained for those responsibilities. And sure, they're all multi-member crew mechanics, but at the same time, that fundamental is built in the two-man, in the one-man crews, the two-umpire system, the one-umpire systems that we're working. So again, continue to work on that fundamental of proper use of eyes and chest to ball. Remember, with chest to ball, we're taking snapshots of critical information like touches, like potential obstruction and things like that. So those fundamentals, as we've seen with all these umpires, particularly the major league clips, like they started in a two-umpire system. You build those habits on those routine plays. That allows you to get these tough ones really early. So proper use of eyes and that chest to ball deal, a really big important factor for us to not only get a lot of things right, but even things like obstruction and ultimately interference. The last thing here, I think that was a big takeaway for me in Type B obstruction, is to let the play continue, and then even at that, we're allowed to adjust it based upon what happens. So, if the defense errs on a subsequent action, we can continue to increase our base award based upon how the play develops. Again, we can take in Type B obstruction, we can impose whatever penalty that we feel, if any, would nullify the act of obstruction. Now that'll go ahead and wrap everything up here for our rule study on both interference and obstruction. It's been a great 7-week study, several weeks on interference and then 4 weeks here on obstruction. We'll roll over next week again, remember, into what makes plate mechanics successful, what makes successful plate umpires. Looking forward to building that three-part series on the habits and the fundamentals necessary to be successful umpires. So we'll be back at it 12:30 Eastern next Friday, May 7th, for the habits that build a successful plate umpire. Continue to work those games, enjoy those things out there. Proper use of eyes, chest to ball, great important ones. Remember, keep working on those routine plays. Take advantage of those routine plays, and then share with us your thoughts and what exactly you're being challenged with. So if you take a look back in the chat, remember in the chat we've got linked to us the feedback form, and that feedback form then will give us some insight on what you're doing well, what you're working on, and what you need help with, and we'd be more than happy to make sure that we can address those things. Appreciate everybody's time and attention and participation as normal. You guys were great in the chat with some fantastic questions. We'll hang around and kick it with any questions we didn't get to. Other than that, we'll see everybody live next Friday, May 7th, for the habits that make successful plate umpires. Thanks for being here, guys. We'll see you next